Somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left, because this is not a right-wing problem. This is a left-wing. Antifa's a bad group.
Antifa is going to be designated a domestic terrorist organization.
A lot of people refuse to believe that Antifa is real. It is just a made-up thing, but I have seen them.
Recently, the most threatening thing I've seen yet was the naked bicyclers in Portland who were protesting ICE down there. I mean, it's getting really ugly.
Here we're in costumes to show just how ridiculous that is.
So where is the Antifa headquarters? I just need to know where they are, how many people. I don't want a name. I don't want anything like that. Just how many people have you identified with the FBI that Antifa is made of?
Well, the investigations are active.
Sir, you wouldn't come to this committee and say something you can't prove. I know. I know you wouldn't do that. But you did.
And they're paid.
I should really stock up on George Soros protest signs. I'm Joe Love. This is Unfuck the Poor, and early listeners will recall that I've been calling Trump a fascist since before it was cool. And now that he and the GOP have decided fascism is actually their platform and not just a coincidence, I might be put on an FBI watch list just for making this episode. You might be put on a watch list for listening to it. That's best case scenario. We could be breaking the law. And because of that, we need to talk about what fascism is and why, even if you never wear black bloc and have no idea how to make a Molotov, you yourself are already anti-fascist, and why ignoring this unusual twist in our timeline or backing away out of fear will be detrimental to us all. It's important to start this episode with a couple of basic truths. First, FBI Director Kash Patel already has a terrible track record of keeping his mouth shut when it comes to active investigations, whether it's announcing that the FBI definitely caught Charlie Kirk's shooter, or posting pictures of evidence on Twitter, or capturing the shooter the other day. This guy would be fired if he was a field agent. Second, do you remember Hunter Biden's laptop? I mean, do you remember how his laptop became the laptop from hell? And how somehow the existence of Hunter Biden's laptop with all of his personal information and nude photos on it became the smoking gun for the innate corruption of the Democratic Party in general, and an indictment of the Biden crime family specifically? You remember how that laptop still manages to make it into right-wing political discourse? And you remember how the Bidens haven't been arrested, investigated, or anything? Conservatives love, really love, getting their hands on something tangible and showing it to the world, and declaring that they were right all along, except the Epstein files. And to be fair, who doesn't love that feeling of being vindicated after being called paranoid or weird? It's perfectly natural that when you get your hands on something that's just too good, you want to share it with the world, but specifically to shove it in the face of your opposition, to say, we have the receipts. Those two things, Kash Patel's show and tell style leadership and conservatives' willingness to beat a dead horse, really need to be kept at the front of your mind when
Trump DHS Secretary Kristi Noem
said this on October 8th, 2025.
One of the individuals we arrested recently in Portland was the girlfriend of one of the founders of Antifa, and that we are hoping that as we go after her, interview her, and prosecute her, we will get more and more information about the network and how we can root them out and eliminate them from the existence of American society.
We haven't heard anything else about it. We've heard plenty about how anyone joining the No Kings protests are Antifa and Hamas terrorists. We've heard how anyone expressing Antifa ideology is a terrorist. Terrorist this, terrorist that. A tight-knit yet widespread organization inciting violence, threatening innocent Americans, and destroying this nation from within. Antifa, Inc., the enemy within. You're a smart person. You know that Antifa is not a terrorist organization because you understand that Antifa is simply shorthand for anti-fascist, which means to be against fascism. However, capital A Antifa is the perfect scapegoat, the perfect bogeyman for everything wrong with the radical left. You know, because there is something wrong with everyone who isn't MAGA. They know there is no Antifa organization, but they're relying on the average American to not know this. Antifa even sounds like a whole ass thing, so as long as they can keep saying Antifa and terrorism in the same sentence, eventually, when the Trump administration starts making political arrests, they can rely on the repetitive association they have worked so hard to manufacture to pass it off as justice. Eventually, the average American conservative will cheer the execution of Trump's political prisoners because of the neurologically hardwired link between the words Democrat, Antifa, and terrorist. That's my morbid prediction, at least. Again, I have to believe that Republican leaders don't only know this, but understand it well enough to exploit it. They know Antifa is an ideology and not an actual group like, say, the Proud Boys, but they understand that average voters have to do a little brain work to make that distinction, so they do their best to short-circuit that thought process. The Proud Boys fall squarely under the modern Republican tent. They are embraced and emboldened by the party. Stand back and stand by. Therefore, it makes sense, at least from the conservative perspective, to link Antifa, the imaginary organization, with the Democratic Party, as in being embraced and emboldened by the Democrats the same way conservatives defend the Proud Boys. Hopefully, I don't have to tell you why this is absurd, but if I do, it's because 99.9% of black bloc-clad anti-fascists would not identify as strictly Democrats, and Democrats are far too conservative and embarrassed to embrace anything perceived as too aggressively left. Hell, they wouldn't even endorse Mamdani for New York City mayor. They have two totally distinct belief systems, with anti-fascists identifying plenty of fascism within modern liberalism. The way beliefs fracture the further to the left you go is just too complex to relay to the average centrist or swing voter. So it's very easy to just say Antifa equals terrorist and Antifa is Democrats, and therefore Democrats are terrorists. I don't need to tell you that the only people who hate anti-fascists are, in fact, fascists. But what does that word even mean? We're using it all the time now. For conservatives, Antifa is used to label people who disagree with conservative policies. And for conservatives, fascism isn't even a real thing, you know? It's just like a word that doesn't mean anything. Conservatives are the party of freedom, just not the freedom to believe that fascism is bad or to criticize the current administration when it engages in fascistic behavior.
It's more accurate description, the Hate America rally.
Seriously, let that one sink in. The First Amendment establishes and confirms our right to say out loud that fascism is the opposite of liberty, of absolute freedom, and that our government should not do fascism. If the language of anti-fascism is so destructive to the existential fabric of the United States, then somewhere along the way, fascism overtook liberty as the force that propels and defines us. The problem with fascism, of course, is that it can easily be denied. It can be cloaked behind the language of patriotism and religion. America is the land of the free, the complete opposite of fascism. Look how free you are, as long as you don't disagree with the party in control of the House, the Senate, the Oval Office, the Supreme Court, the bureaucracy that took half a century to seize control of. Christians can't be fascists. They believe in traditional family values and the good book. Besides, only Mussolini's National Fascist Party was ever really truly fascist. It's right there in the name, Fascist Party. As if the taboo of fascism had always existed, but only Mussolini was depraved enough to embrace it. The problem is, fascism did not always exist, and fascism did not die with Mussolini at the end of a rope or Hitler in his bunker. Fascism is a product of the 20th century, and in the 21st century, its mutant bastard offspring has sprung from the blood and soil and wrapped itself in the stars and stripes. Authoritarianism certainly existed before fascism, as did nationalism, dictatorships, oppression, censorship, racism, genocide, and xenophobia. But the combination of the 20th century's technology, industry, capitalism, and mass communication is what made fascism possible. The infrastructure for fascism is a permanent feature of modernity. But because fascism is relatively new, about a century old, it has many more permutations to take in our lifetimes and beyond. That's depressing and frightening and insurmountable. Fascism first appears as a faint hum in the background of modern life, easy enough to ignore and brush off. It sounds like casual racism and conspiracy. This is not in your day-to-day conversations. You will always hear someone on their bullshit about something. No, you will hear the call of fascism through some form of media. When I was a kid, it was AM radio and these little cartoon booklets that people left in the park that told of the coming of the Antichrist and the Jewish conspiracy against the West and making sure America was ready for the second coming of Christ. That's the fringe element, and it always speaks to us in a way that makes some people very happy to hear someone finally say what everyone has been thinking. Fascism seeps into the mainstream in fits and starts. Push back against it, and it retreats because the stage isn't set yet. But it waits and plots. Fascism works in the background to build enough of a following to find its way into more popular media, to influence policy, and to hold office. Fascism takes time. The irony is that once fascism takes over, it is purely reactionary. All the effort and detail put into plotting, no matter how granular and well thought out, it all flies out the window once it holds power. Because fascism is not enough to hold together the myriad parties that colluded to crush the opposition. Think about the current state of American politics, the big Republican tent where Confederate and Nazi flags make appearances at rallies, where devout evangelicals share the stage with philanderers and predators, where capitalists rely on the state for tax relief and massive contracts and favorable legislation, where conservative minorities share media space with conservative extremists who would just as soon have them arrested or deported. Currently, the only thing binding all these disparate groups is the elderly man who commands rabid loyalty from his voting base. It's all just barely holding on, and the reason it's so fragile is the combination of all the things that made it possible in the first place. When the fascist state takes control of the media, no matter how streamlined the propaganda apparatus, no matter how modern and quick it can churn out content, it can never keep up pace with modern life. Fascism may be reactionary, but it does not operate at the speed of infinite neurons firing every second of every day. Industry may ramp up to scales never thought possible, but resources are finite, and purchasing power is always hampered by isolationism and tariffs and suppressed wages. We may have mile-long data centers and self-driving cars, a communications infrastructure that literally shoves content into our eyeballs every waking moment, logistics networks that can get nearly anything to the consumer overnight, and consolidated media outlets that parrot the same talking points to millions of viewers and listeners. But empire is the wet dream of capitalism, and once fascism attempts to seep out of its borders, it will ultimately be overwhelmed by too many battles on too many fronts, both figuratively and literally. The collapse of every fascist regime begins as soon as it peaks. Fascism requires exponential effort to make minor advances. That's why dystopian movies, television shows, and novels are so frightening. What if, next time, fascism doesn't implode? Orwell's 1984, one of my favorite novels, captures this fear perfectly. Winston Smith is just an average man who contemplates rebellion and becomes targeted and brutalized by the state, followed and captured through its vast surveillance network. Adam Johnson's The Orphan Master's Son stokes this fear through visceral descriptions of life and torture in North Korea. What these novels make clear, and what the memoirs of North Korean refugees affirm, is that fascism is not compatible with the human spirit. Every story reveals that anti-fascism is our default state. Okay, that's my freestyle rant on fascism. Done. Not going to do it again, maybe. Sure, it's a relatively modern concept made possible by technology and a bunch of other shit, but where did fascism come from? So, it's the 1920s after World War I. I'm so sorry this is going to be so boring, but only for you, not for me. I love this shit. It's the 1920s after World War I, and the world has fundamentally changed. The multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires have collapsed, and new nation-states have formed from the remains. When a colonizing empire collapses or withdraws, there is no more forceful cohesion. The power structure is just gone. And so with newly drawn borders and the freedom to self-determine, there is a scramble to secure power and create independent nations defined by, you guessed it, ethnicity and shared identity. That's nationalism. After the Great War, nationalism exploded in the Western world, which had just tried to commit suicide. Everyone embraced nationalism. Americans, the British, the French, Germany. Japan, Italy, each nation had a shared trauma from the brutality of modern warfare, which formed the root of nationalist movements, some more forceful than others. Italy, if you'll recall, is where Rome is, which was the largest empire in the world a couple thousand years ago. Benito Mussolini said, hey, Rome is in Italy, therefore the Romans were Italian, and we're Italian, therefore we have the blood of the world's greatest empire coursing through us. And to symbolize Italy's connection to ancient Rome, Mussolini chose the fasces. That is an axe with a bundle of birch sticks tied around the handle. Now, the fasces was effectively a tool for punishment carried by Roman magistrates, used to beat peasants into submission with the birch sticks and or decapitate them with the axe. The practical murder tool fasces ultimately became a symbol of power, no longer used for physical punishment. A magistrate or king carrying a fasces indicated to the peasants that he held absolute power over the military and the law. It was printed on coins and painted on murals and put on flags, and there's fasces all over Washington, D.C., in sculptures and paintings, and even behind the podium in the House of Representatives to this day. Go to a government building or office, and odds are somewhere you will find a bundle of sticks with an axe head poking out. Hell, there's one under Lincoln's right hand on the Emancipation Monument on Capitol Hill. Side note, there is also a quaint, innocent interpretation of the fasces that says, an axe with one handle is weak, but an axe with a shitload of handles is strong. Now, it's important to note that Mussolini relied on this quaint interpretation of the fasces to represent national unity, shared identity, the absolute power of the state protected by the people. Yeah, but no. The fasces was used for brutalizing peasants. Regardless, Mussolini adopted the symbol and name of Roman torture and capital punishment for his new political party in 1919, the Italian Fasces of Combat, which transformed into the National Fascist Party in 1922. Originally a socialist, Mussolini was ousted from the Italian Socialist Party in 1912 for promoting engagement in the Great War, World War I. After that, in 1914, he founded the newspaper Il Popolo d'Italia, the People of Italy, which surprisingly really pushed for Italy to drop its neutrality during World War I and enter combat. It really, really wanted military intervention. You see, newspapers were like the social media of the 1900s. If you wanted to communicate with a bunch of people, like, say, an entire nation, you could just print and distribute a newspaper. That was, and still is, an expensive business, so you could get advertisers, sure, but you could also get donors and benefactors. And if you're promoting war in your newspaper, who best to make secret donations to that paper than industrialists who would profit from military intervention and the nations who wanted Italy's support for the war? In 1917, the United Kingdom paid Il Popolo d'Italia £100 a week for Mussolini to crack down on anti-war protests. They wanted Italy to come to war. Industrialists from all over Italy spent money on Mussolini's newspapers to spread pro-war propaganda. Italian hydroelectric company Edison funded the paper, believing that increased war spending would result in an increased demand for electric power. Italian carmaker Fiat gave money to the paper, believing that war spending would result in government contracts for military vehicles. Italian iron and weapons manufacturer Ansaldo, Italian steel and naval works company Acciaierie d'Oro, and Italian sugar barons all funneled money into not only Mussolini's newspaper, but all Italian nationalist newspapers pushing for Italy's involvement in World War I. All of them had a lot of money to be made in the event that Italy declared war and started pumping money into the industrial sector. And right here is why fascism could not have arisen until the 20th century. You have nationalist, fascist newspapers essentially pushing a shared ideology that scorns egalitarianism, labor unions, and class consciousness in favor of industrial and geopolitical alignment. You have air travel, wired communications, and radio stations to broadcast this message all over an entire nation. The folly of fascism was spread throughout Italy by the same industries that expected windfalls from its success. This is why we say fascism is capitalism's inevitable conclusion. So let's turn to modern day to examine the parallels. Let's imagine that some billionaires wanted us to pay attention to them. Newspapers are mostly dead and cable television subscriptions have tanked. So would it be a stretch for a billionaire techno-industrialist to purchase a social media company, or for a billionaire former president to launch his own social media company? Would it be a stretch if billionaires swooped into the dying print and cable news industries and gobbled up established papers and news networks? If they did that, they would instantly have access to billions of eyeballs, not only in their own countries, but around the entire world. They could say literally whatever they wanted and instantly have it be seen by me, you, and your racist uncle. You might see the CEOs of the world's largest corporations suddenly become very interested in the former president. They might be granted access to our nation's most sensitive data, and they might be allowed to strip billions in funding from departments they don't like. Perhaps if they were under investigation, they might just take money away from the department investigating them. They might make huge donations and get invited to the president's second inauguration. They might get government contracts from the president. They might get legislation passed deregulating or preventing the regulation of their specific industries. They might push for suppressing labor unions because they have a bunch of warehouses with terrible working conditions. Their news companies might get preferential treatment for praising a second-term president, while their competitors get shut out and vilified or mocked for asking pretty basic questions about things like conflicts of interest, transparency, and the Epstein files. It might become the case that disagreeing with the president and his party leaders is equated with treason and terrorism, amplified by the president posting nonstop on his own social media app. And it might just happen that once in power, the seizure of the state complete after decades of plotting and positioning, the president may find himself finally able to act with impunity like a king or a dictator. He might be able to form his own secret police force with state money to inflict terror and submission on the very people he claimed to love, except his enemies.
But all of the things that we've given, and they wouldn't vote only because they hate Trump. But I hate them too, you know that? So it's sort of, I really do, I hate them. I cannot stand them because I really believe they hate our country. You want to know the truth?
Okay, I'm talking about Donald Trump and Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and David Ellison and Peter Thiel. It's the fascist playbook wrapped in the American flag. And instead of propaganda newspapers slapping against your door every morning, it's a barrage of notifications from the president himself stroking his own ego or demonizing his opponents. It's established newspapers like the Washington Post saying billionaires aren't the problem. Established networks like CNN shifting to conservative talking points and giving Erica Kirk her own show. It's the same fucking thing. It was fascism 100 years ago, and it's fascism today. Whatever shiny new form fascism takes on, whether it dons a red hat and hugs the American flag, bribes foreign governments to overlook genocide, or puts on a rock concert while the economy is tanking, it simply isn't new. The tools and industries are new, but the playbook is the exact same fucking thing. Fascism is the inevitable outcome of capitalism. And because fascism, I could be arrested for saying that. Isn't that fun? Now you might be saying, sure, it looks like Italian fascism, but this isn't Italy, and no one is using the term fascist, and we've never even heard of the fascies, and no one waves a bundle of sticks around, so this isn't real, true fascism. It's just how politics is nowadays. And you know, I agree. In 8th grade, a visiting history professor asked our history class, does anyone think a fascist takeover could not happen in the United States? And I was the only kid who raised their hand because I have always been an optimist. I wasn't scolded, per se, but I was definitely humbled by that professor who outlined point by point how fascism could easily take root in America, how a charismatic leader could sway a nation towards atrocity. Thanks to Mr. Klaus, I have been on guard ever since. And thanks to the first-hand experiences of those who lived under fascism in Italy and Germany, we have come to understand quite clearly what it looks like when it pops up and what to call it. Italian writer and social political critic Umberto Eco called the phenomenon of spontaneous fascism Ur-Fascism, U-R, which means proto-fascism, primitive, or elemental. There are elements of Italian fascism in countries that are not Italy. There are parties of fascism that do not rely on the specific imagery of Mussolini's Italy. Gone are the fascies and black shirts of yesterday. Here today are the red MAGA hats and assault rifles and plate armor. Gone are the state newspapers, and in their place, conservative social media influencers, Truth Social, podcasts, and gutted news outlets turned blood red. Eco's essay, Ur-Fascism, richly describes 14 elements of primitive fascism meant to alert us to the early signs of fascism's creep. If Umberto Eco isn't a familiar name to you, or if you've never heard of Ur-Fascism, it's fine. I mean, it's infuriating that Eco grew up under Mussolini's fascism, told us what to look for and how to defend against it, and yet here we are in 2025 trying to figure out, hey, is this fascism? But I digress. It's fine. Okay, without any more delay. Eco's core elements of eternal fascism, the underlying features of a social or political movement that should give us pause. 1. The cult of tradition and syncretism. Syncretism is the blending of multiple historic, mystic, or ancient beliefs or myths to create a shared perfect past. In other words, throw everything we used to believe into a blender and then say that the slurry is the elixir for creating the future. American fascism is unique because America does not have a huge history to be mythologized, but we make do. Conservatives have a daddy kink for the Founding Fathers and constitutional originalism, a poodle skirt kink for the idyllic imagery of 1950s Americana and innocence, and a spiritual kink for Judeo-Christian values and a throbbing rectum for institutionalized ignorance. What makes the cult of tradition and syncretism specifically fascist is that in order to believe the entire mythology, you must be able to at once accept and ignore the contradictory, hypocritical clashes that you inevitably encounter. For example, America the Christian nation is established in the Constitution because it mentions God the Creator, and because many of the Founding Fathers themselves were Christian. However, this belief completely ignores the fact that during the Constitutional Congress, the Founding Fathers explicitly steered away from Christianity as a foundational religion because the Church of England had been used as a means to exercise British control within the colonies. Christianity itself does not align with free market capitalism. A true Christian nation would not have interest rates on loans. Usury is a fundamental evil, and would provide free housing and food and health care. The near-religious obsession with the Constitution as political and legal perfection creates serious conflict with the aforementioned belief that America is a Christian nation. Modern education has become vilified for both teaching an accurate history of America's founding and for not teaching the Christian Bible. We have a serious problem with education in America. When the Secretary of Education says that the department shouldn't even exist and that parents should be the final authority on what their children are taught because modern education corrupts traditional values, the only possible outcome is that education is to be avoided in order to protect the myth of the state. That's syncretism, the blending of many different beliefs that inevitably contradict each other to create a shared perfect past that defines the traditional values of the state. Where American fascism gets weird is its insistence on its past and its obsession with technological superiority. But this belief is right there in the conservative slogan, "Make America Great Again." Now, the phrase has always bothered me. It is a philosophical time loop. It looks both to the future, make America, and calls to the past, great again. As long as this phrase persists, we exist smack in the middle of it. Right now, we are not great, and something is holding us back. Immigrants, homosexuality, liberals. We must be more traditional to become great. But as long as that slogan remains, we will never be great. 2. Rejection of modernism. We just touched on this in the cult of tradition, and in a sense it is a continuation. It's important here to note that a rejection of modernism is not a promotion of primitivism. Technology is embraced, while the theory of knowledge that produces technology is rejected. Because epistemology requires broad philosophical perspectives, and those philosophical perspectives are the foundational elements of personal and social enlightenment, the state rejects the premise that broad knowledge is necessary. The state will embrace education that promotes the technology of power and control. Military equipment, surveillance tools, mass communication, guns, cryptocurrency, satellites. As a result, we worship Silicon Valley billionaires and industry disruption, but reject university research. We celebrate medical technology, but distrust epidemiologists and public health. We embrace social media, but claim universities are brainwashing centers. We revere engineers and entrepreneurs, but mock experts. The scientific method under this belief system will ultimately become anathema to the state if it suggests that our information system is incomplete. Let me break it down for you like this. Trump is the best. He has the best words. He knows the most about everything. The person at the top of the fascist pyramid cannot be superseded by any person or idea. There can be no discoveries in fascism because there is nothing left to discover. There is no need for unemployment reporting because Trump says employment rates are up. Anything that contradicts the leader is fake news. The third element of proto-fascism is action for action's sake. Because independent thought is counter to the narrative that dear leader has all the answers, we cannot think too much about any current crisis making its rounds in the news cycle. In Eco's words, quote, "Action being beautiful in itself, it must be taken before or without any previous reflection. Thinking is a form of emasculation," end quote. When Cracker Barrel changes its logo and it's presented to us as losing some critical component of our national identity, we can't just roll over and take it or be indifferent. We must act on that threat to our identity because it symbolizes the encroachment of modernity on traditional values. Never mind that of all the things that don't matter, Cracker Barrel probably matters the least. The public was outraged. Cracker Barrel retreated, the logo returned to normal, and then what? Was there a celebration? Did conservatives suddenly flock to Cracker Barrel across the nation to celebrate their victory over woke capital? Yeah, I don't even know. Do you remember what happened after? I don't. It wasn't more than a week before we moved on to the next outrage, probably Antifa or trans people. We can see the action for action's sake across countless conservative causes. The haphazard militarization of ICE and Border Patrol with daily quotas that round up legal citizens at alarming rates and then just disappear them. The sheer velocity with which Trump went from dangling architectural renderings of his new ballroom to destroying the entire East Wing. The pointless insurrection of January 6th that, once it reached the literal floor of Congress, had no direction or goal. It's the dog that finally catches its own tail. There is no plan except to act quickly. Even when the action is a success, there is no positive result. Doge got access everywhere it wanted and took all the data it wanted, did not produce any evidence of fraud. You realize fraud is an actual legal thing that you prosecute people for. We have no prosecutions. Alligator Alcatraz went up in a hurry, spent hundreds of millions of dollars, got a bunch of laughs from conservatives and I guess some hats, but then now it's just a huge waste of money and apparently the new Abu Ghraib, mission accomplished. This is the churn of rage. Think of some of the inconsequential outrages over the past few years. The green M&M not being sexy anymore, Dylan Mulvaney holding a Bud Light, the constant witch hunt over whatever's woke this week. If the news cycle stayed on any of these topics long enough, public interest wouldn't just fade, but the public might come to realize that perhaps sexualizing candy mascots isn't a news story, and that Dylan Mulvaney is just a person advertising beer, and that the word woke is literally just a trigger for a Pavlovian response. The performance of rage is the whole point, and before that rage can subside through either acceptance or resignation, the state and its propaganda machine just churn up brand new rage over and over. 4. Following action for action's sake is the rejection of analytical criticism. A contradictory and hypocritical syncretic faith cannot withstand a critical eye because those beliefs simply fall apart. To distinguish or ask for explanation does not advance the efforts of the fascist state, but rather exposes its shallowness. 5. Fear of difference. Fascism purposely and effectively exploits our subconscious willingness to succumb to our fear of the unknown. Eco doesn't go into this very deeply, so I'll keep it brief. Psychologically, humans are pretty interesting when it comes to the unknown. Plenty to be said about in-group, out-group psychology, pattern seeking and threat detection, tribal cooperation, and how humans perceive disgust. Humans have the capacity to live in multicultural, cosmopolitan societies as much as they have the capacity to live in closed-off, racially homogenous ones. Fascism seeks to identify a superior class within diverse societies, specifically societies where the fascist already occupies the class majority. Fascism is inherently regressive, intent on undoing social progress as a means to promote cultural uniformity. And that has as much to do with race as it does with religion, sexuality, and philosophy. Under fascism, diversity itself becomes a symbol of decay. Society would be better without the other. Language to this effect might include such words or phrases as,
"They're poisoning the blood of our country." That's what they've done.
The Democratic Party is trying to replace the current electorate, the voters now casting ballots, with new people, more obedient voters from the third world.
Ilhan Omar is garbage. She's garbage. Her friends are garbage. These aren't people that work. These aren't people that say, let's go, come on, let's make this place great. These are people that do nothing but complain.
Diversity is seen as a deviation from the norm, which critically undermines the narrative that there is one true and acceptable social class. This is where fascism targets its violence. Diversity is the same as dissent, and dissent is treason. Fascism is not only racist, but otherist by definition. 6. Appeal to a frustrated middle class. The middle class is under attack. It is true. The middle class should feel secure about their social position, but they feel it slipping away. They worry about the world their children will be raised in. They feel the pinch of economic stagnation, both from suppressed wages and price inflation. Their communities are no longer the idyllic scenes they remember from their own childhoods, where they could ride their bikes until the streetlights came on. These are all valid frustrations from the middle class, but fascists distract the middle class from the true perpetrators of this system of rising inequality. The elite and powerful who pay starvation wages and game the stock market to balloon their outsized wealth, who artificially raise market rates for rents and home prices, deregulation that accelerates environmental decay, corporations that offshore labor to the lowest bidder and leave prospering cities to rot. Instead, the elites, through propaganda and politicians, point the finger at the lower classes as the ones pulling down the middle class. The middle class always distances itself from the working class and impoverished, despite the fact that the middle class is closer to food scarcity and homelessness than they are to being carefree millionaires and billionaires. The middle class is built up with the narrative that society is a meritocracy, that you can work hard and gain fabulous success. They look at the lower classes as parasites living off the taxes that go into the welfare state. The middle class does not see government assistance as a safety net, but a cop-out for the lazy and entitled. Fascists promise the middle class that their success is tied directly to the success of the state, and that for the state to prosper, others must suffer. But suffering is not to be felt by those at the top, those to whom tax subsidies and lucrative government contracts are rewarded. The suffering is to be felt by those beneath them. The fascist, having successfully divided society among cultural differences, is able to weaponize the fear of difference within the middle class to crush union movements and shame the poor and disabled for being unable to provide for themselves. Even if a fascist state cannot make good on its promises of economic prosperity, which it cannot ever, they can at least guarantee that the middle class will remain superior to the lower classes, and in the eyes of the fascist state, they will enjoy a position of privilege which is psychologically more appealing than actual economic stability. 7. Obsession with a plot. The fascist state is inherently narcissistic, believing it is the target of mass conspiracies from the deep state to globalists. Fascism must center the world around itself in order to solidify its national identity. Your belonging to the state is your core privilege. In Eco's words, quote, "This is the origin of nationalism. Besides, the only ones who can provide an identity to the nation are its enemies." End quote. When fascism faces its myriad failures, it will never accept responsibility. Fascists cannot conceive of failure, only sabotage. This both reinforces the belief that diversity is treason and that citizens are in a constant fight for survival. Recall that fascism demands we not think too hard about what the state tells us. For example, Democrats have billions of dollars in secret funding and a terrorist network of Antifa thugs and cheat in all the elections, and yet they don't control the courts or Congress, and protesters are regularly brutalized by police. Compare the dueling narratives of the left, the purple-haired soy boy liberal who doesn't know what a woman is, versus the militant Antifa terrorist cells that have infiltrated all major cities funded by a globalist dark money network. It doesn't make any sense. Are they physical and mental weaklings, or are they cunning militants constantly plotting America's downfall? Fascism insists we mock our enemies while simultaneously being terrified of them. The obsession with the plot fulfills itself. You don't need evidence to believe in the plot, just a belief. The lack of evidence is actually a gift. It means the conspiracy is so deep that they've hidden all the evidence. And if you get evidence to the contrary, it's just more evidence of how widespread the cover-up is. And because the plot is a fiction, you can draw connections between all the plots against the state. Conspiracy explains every shortcoming of the fascist state, and once you determine that the conspiracy is meant to destroy your very identity, you can justify any extreme to prevent it, specifically violence against your enemies. They're no longer political opponents, they're enemies of the state attempting a coup. 8. Humiliation at the hands of the enemy. Eco's words, quote, "The followers must feel humiliated by the ostentatious wealth and force of their enemies. When I was a boy, I was taught to think of Englishmen as the five-meal people. They ate more frequently than the poor but sober Italians. Jews are rich and help each other through a secret web of mutual assistance. However, the followers must be convinced that they can overwhelm the enemies. Thus, by a continuous shifting of rhetorical focus, the enemies are at the same time too strong and too weak. Fascist governments are condemned to lose wars because they are constitutionally incapable of objectively evaluating the force of the enemy." End quote. The 21st century American version of this humiliation is more complex than simply how many meals an enemy eats or how connected a specific people seem to be. Pride parades are an ostentatious display of cultural wealth and sexual freedom. The sexually repressed conservative is humiliated by the pride flag and resentful of queer acceptance. It makes sense, then, that the conservative counter-narrative to acceptable sexuality finds its extreme in the bland white and pastel heteronormative trad wife aesthetic. Even when a couple doesn't own a 200-acre farm or have any traditional skill sets, they appear in family photos with a vague semblance of pastoral life. Rustic wood furniture and clothes that appear handmade, materials of gingham and plaid and leather. The contrast is a bit too on the nose. Conservatives take the same route when it comes to the coastal elites, mocking prestigious university education and withholding their federal funding, dismissing the knowledge and guidance of experts in favor of those who agree with the trust your gut instincts and move fast, break stuff philosophy of public policy. The fusion of big tech and the Trump administration is not a conservative win. As long as the wealthiest men in the world pledge fealty to Trump, they are protected from the critical eye of conservatives. The collective wealth of Zuckerberg, Bezos, and Musk is truly offensive. But if they are seen as being under party control, then protecting their wealth is seen as protecting the state. How, then, does Trump's offensive wealth not draw anger from his supporters? Trump plays the victim card to ingratiate himself to voters. In all regards, he is obnoxiously successful, yet his narrative is that he sacrifices even greater wealth to defend vulnerable Americans under attack from the evil Democrats, the enemy within. He loses out on billions in profits just to save this country. Trump plays the role of sacrificial lamb constantly hunted by bloodthirsty wolves. Just ignore the fact that he spends millions of tax dollars on golf trips, holds extravagant parties at Mar-a-Lago while his poorest constituents lose access to food stamps, and directly profits from his presidency. Trump promises to punish and humiliate the elites, the queer, those who dare to put pronouns in their email signatures. Trump's crudeness is what endears him to the humiliated classes. Those who feel left behind by progressivism also feel a sense of safety when the leader of the free world doesn't succumb to the woke nonsense of political correctness or inclusion, and hey, the guy loves McDonald's, so he's one of us, right? 9. Life is permanent warfare. Eco's words, quote, "For Ur-Fascism, there is no struggle for life, but rather life is lived for struggle. Thus, pacifism is trafficking with the enemy. It is bad because life is permanent warfare. This, however, brings about an Armageddon complex. Since enemies have to be defeated, there must be a final battle after which the movement will have control of the world. But such a final solution implies a future era of peace, a golden age which contradicts the principle of permanent war. No fascist leader has ever succeeded in solving this predicament." End quote. You might be saying, but Trump calls himself the peace president and lists all the wars he's ended and makes demands for the Nobel Peace Prize. And this is where fascism takes an ugly psychological turn, if we haven't already done that. Trump's idea of international peace is constantly staying on the brink of war. Military mobilizations, threats against other nations, attacks on civilians in open water, double tapping, an unpredictable military strategy while in command of the world's largest military. Trump constantly invokes his convoluted global peacekeeping strategy by insisting that he's the only reason World War III hasn't broken out, that war with Ukraine would be over in 24 hours. It's been 9 months and counting since he took office, and still it's going on. He claims that he negotiated peace in Gaza. Israel is still committing genocide. and that nuclear testing is vitally important because they could start a nuclear war at any moment. For international matters, the threat of war is everywhere, and Trump would have us believe that he is the only thing standing in its way, despite the fact that he seems to be doing everything possible to keep us right on the cusp of war. Domestic peace is another lie altogether. For fascists, domestic peace is a fantasy. Remember, Trump is the one who says, "Fight like hell." Not very peaceful, and they're destroying our country. Therefore, extreme measures must be taken domestically to get the enemy under control. The fascist does not accomplish peace by diplomacy. Coexistence is a form of diversity, and that's treasonous. Negotiation is never an option. Capitulation is the only acceptable power dynamic. Peaceful protest must be illegal for some reason to justify the use of force against citizens. Real laws don't need to be broken, for the fascists can claim that a law exists by simply using common sense. If you didn't see it, Seth Meyers, the late-night talk show host, might be breaking the law because he doesn't support Trump. Lawbreakers are criminals, and there is no nuance for the fascist. A criminal is violent by nature of being a criminal. Therefore, Seth Meyers making jokes and critiques about Trump is a form of violence. Nothing has to make sense so long as you're ready to fight. When Trump says he is the peace president, what he means is that you will not be a victim of aggression as long as you submit to the will of the state. Peace equals submission or obliteration. The fascist needs violence and war and a populace ready to act on a moment's notice in order to maintain power. This cycle is exhausting, and it's meant to be. The exhaustion is how the fascist achieves dominance. 10. Popular elitism. Per Eco, quote, "Elitism is a typical aspect of any reactionary ideology insofar as it's fundamentally aristocratic. An aristocratic and militaristic elitism cruelly implies contempt for the weak." End quote. Because the fascist exploits the feelings of weakness among the masses, they must bestow upon the masses a feeling of superiority based on those perceived weaknesses. Again, Eco's words, quote, "Every citizen belongs to the best people of the world. The members of the party are the best among the citizens. Every citizen can or ought to become a member of the party. American fascism has appeal here. The fascist says, you, the commoner, the uneducated blue-collar American, you are the real elite. You built this country with your physical labor. You're wiser than Ivy League graduates. Your patriotism is your value. You didn't learn to hate America through woke liberal college professors, and you, the real Americans, deserve your place at the top." And of course, that's 100% true. The working class did build this nation, but they did so under the thumb of the ruling class. And the ruling class wants to make absolutely sure that the working class never gains power. 11. The cult of the hero, the cult of death. Through the appeals of popular elitism, the constant state of readiness for war, and the willingness to act for action's sake, fascists tell their people that they are born heroes by virtue of being born within their borders. The populace lives a heroic life in all they do, because every day is a fight against the conspiratorial other. The language of death is tied to the language of heroicism. That is alive and well here in America in bumper sticker philosophies such as "From my cold dead hands," "Don't tread on me," and "Come and take it." The imagery of death is all around us. The Punisher skull adopted by cops and cosplayers, the thin blue line representing the civilian divide between chaos and order, and even within extremist slogans like Deus Vult, which was the warrior cry of the Crusades, meaning war sanctified by God. I have to add Deus Vult because, god damn it, it's a white nationalist slogan, and I saw it on a vanity license plate. Heroic language is strictly linked with the cult of death and represents a high fantasy of the average citizen dying for a grand cause and becoming a martyr like Ashley Babbitt, or an average citizen taking the law into his own hands and becoming a party hero like Kyle Rittenhouse. But the best of all possible worlds is when a well-known or even famous symbol of the party is killed and their martyrdom renews a warrior spirit with fresh rage, as in the murder of Charlie Kirk and the conservative response. They have no idea what they have awakened. 12. Machismo. The fascist has a preoccupation with sexuality. From an intense focus on transgender genitalia, a constant repudiation of non-heteronormative relationships, and repression of women's rights around their sexuality, from abortion to birth control to no-fault divorce and all sorts of ignorance around rape, misogyny is downplayed as locker room talk, rape is seen as juvenile misstep, and pedophilia becomes normalized as adult men infantilize adult women. Per Eco, quote, "Since even sex is a difficult game to play, the Ur-Fascist hero tends to play with weapons. Doing so becomes an ersatz phallic exercise," end quote. I could write an entire episode on this single quote. I won't, but I could. So let's talk about sex. What is good sex? Good sex is reciprocal. Both partners climax and are satisfied. That requires communication, vulnerability, emotional intimacy, the potential for rejection. Even a loving couple that has a healthy sex life can be out of sync. One can be in the mood while the other is in a funk. And love means accepting that without taking it personally. A rejection of intimacy doesn't necessarily mean a rejection of the whole other person. An emotionally secure partner understands this. But the fascist is not emotionally mature or secure. Intimacy and vulnerability and communication are weaknesses. They see all of these elements as a loss of control, a humiliation, and a compromise. That is to say, a net loss. Guns, on the other hand, are fun to play with. They are predictable. Every time a bullet fires is like a mini orgasm. The fascist loves to pose with guns, to shoot guns. Guns never say no. Guns can be controlled. Guns affirm the user's power and prowess. And the target at the other end of the barrel is automatically in submission, something to be dominated. Where the fascist is insecure about size and stamina and vulnerability, the gun makes up for every shortcoming. A gun is always hard and rigid. It is always ready to perform, and there's a direct relation between size and performance. A larger gun does more damage, makes more noise, is more intimidating. But even a small gun has its place, and gun nuts always have a favorite plinking gun that is more representative of their own genitalia than larger calibers. An obsession over tactical gear makes the gun obsession obvious even when the gun is not on display. Combine a large lifted truck and the phallic representation doubles. Rolling coal is a literal metaphor for ejaculation. Aggressive driving is a form of dominance. Toss in a gun rack and truck nuts and you've got a rolling anal fixation. The ersatz phallus and school shootings are intertwined. If you want to know why we don't do anything about school shootings, you don't need to understand the Second Amendment. You don't need to understand violent crime statistics. You just need to understand that sexually frustrated fascists recognize their own and understand deep down that to put any restrictions on gun ownership is akin to self-castration. In the American fascist state, the cult of the gun is so powerful that no conservative lawmaker can be shamed into gun control, because doing so would be like exposing his tiny mushroom dick to the world and asking his wife to cut it off on live television. For many fascists, the only sense of power they actually feel is in the potential to take away another human life. School shootings are the natural consequence of this obsession. Children represent the intimacy withheld from the incel shooter. Children represent innocence, hope, love, the future. All things denied or stunted in a school shooter. And the result is pure fascism, action for action's sake, immortality through infamy, complete domination. So long as the fascist state persists, so too will its violence. To solve the violence is to dissolve fascism, and the fascist cannot admit that violence is a problem because that is the only identity they know. 13. Selective populism. The people have spoken. The people are white, Christian, conservatives, who just so happen to agree with the party in charge. If you disagree, you are not the people. Actually, they did vote for this. The fascists can claim democratic legitimacy. I won the election by a lot, while delegitimizing the democratic process. Voting becomes performative. Political opposition is irrelevant because they aren't real Americans. In fact, Democrats are anti-American, trying to tear this country apart. So why would you give them anything they want? Trump is exceptionally good at this part of fascism, from denying minorities and protected classes their civil rights because they don't agree with them, to withholding federal funds to blue states because they aren't part of Trump's America. Eco directly calls upon George Orwell's concept of newspeak to explain fascist language. But the problem with Orwell is that Orwell was smart. And newspeak is the product of a smart man thinking how a government can control language. Fascists do not think of control at this level. Fascists rely on repetition and rhetoric. American newspeak is dumb, painfully dumb. Maybe you'll recognize some of the new American vocabulary. Build the wall, lock her up, stop the steal, drain the swamp, illegal alien, patriot, traitor, CRT, DEI, woke, groomer, socialist, communist, Marxist, freedom, just asking questions, let's go Brandon, fake news, cancel culture. Per Eco, quote, all the Nazi or fascist schoolbooks made use of an impoverished vocabulary and an elementary syntax in order to limit the instruments for complex and critical reasoning, end quote. And that is exactly what Trump does. Trump enforces the language of the Conservative Party by sheer repetition with little to no variation. He introduces short phrases that are a call to action with no cause and no finality. Chants of lock her up during his campaign against Hillary Clinton offered no factual assertions. She was not being locked up for anything specifically, rather because she was hated. And once she's locked up, then what? Lock her up is newspeak, action for action's sake. Trump promised to persecute and prosecute one of conservative America's most hated women, and when he became president, she went free. No locking her up. Just defeated at the polls. You could say it was a failed campaign promise, but Trump supporters will tell you it's just something they said because they hated Clinton. Fair enough. Build the wall is a great example of a slogan turned campaign promise turned practical failure. A wall got built in some places, then painted black in some areas, but it didn't really do anything. It was a simple solution to a complex problem, and shockingly, the simple solution didn't solve anything. Calling something woke simply dismisses it because it promotes diversity. Calling someone a groomer incites immediate rage. CRT is anti-white racism. DEI is minorities in position of power. Fake news is any time you're proven wrong. Socialist, communist, Marxist is pretty much anyone not conservative, and they may or may not be Jewish. Donald Trump operates at a fourth grade reading level, which is perfect for massive crowds because it appeals to the lowest common denominator without having to get into messy details or asking listeners to make any complex connections between thoughts. Trump can repeat a lie until it becomes true. Stop the steal. He doesn't deviate from his basic language. Great, beautiful, tremendous. Unless he wants to get real dirty and lets a shit or a fuck out of the bag. Voters respond to this because he sounds like one of them. He doesn't speak like a politician. He speaks simply, which means he must be telling the truth. He uses simple words, which is a rejection of education and elitism. His stunted language is the language of authenticity. And the problem with other conservatives is they don't have anyone with Trump's honest ignorance and charisma. Everyone else, Stephen Miller, Steve Bannon, Pete Hegseth, Pam Bondi, Carolyn Levitt, Fox News, they are all much smarter than Trump, and God help them all, they try to simplify their language, but it is too calculated and too unnatural. They certainly play their parts, though. They reinforce the key component of fascist newspeak, which is simplicity, repetition, and action. In the 21st century, our president now effectively communicates policy without words, relying on memes to get entire points across. From a crowned king Trump dumping his own toxic diarrhea on protesters to slogans replacing actual policy. American fascist newspeak achieves virality through simplicity and outrage. It makes communication outside of this framework increasingly difficult. When you simplify language, you lose nuance and context. Issues become black and white. Clarification becomes obfuscation. If you're using too many words, you must be lying because no one can follow what you're saying. You can't operate democratically if you separate a nation into us and them, which is what fascism's ultimate goal is, and language is the key player in that regard. Banning books isn't about offensive content, it's about limiting children's access to diversity in language. It's about homogenization and simplification. Once you lose the ability to think critically, to use complex thought, you lose the ability to resist fascism. Okay. Let's take a breather because you just learned that America is actually currently very much a fascist state and that Donald Trump operates as a fascist, like he was born to do it. And you have just realized that you are against such a thing, and that makes you, by default, an anti-fascist, which means you are now an enemy of Donald Trump and therefore the state, and now, big deep breath, you are entitled to some of that sweet George Soros money because you have just been indoctrinated into Antifa Inc., the terrorist network of leftist lunatics and radicals who dare to say, hey, let's not with all this. We shouldn't do fascist stuff because it will result in like a lot of death, and we don't want that. We like people, like not as a threat, but like that's where they're taking us. It's all there. Dehumanizing the opposition, obsession with guns, action for action's sake, the warrior ethos, the cult of the hero and the cult of death. It's all in the simplistic language and imagery and brainwashing required to make us forget that we have actual human beings living all around us and not mortal enemies. Am I going to be arrested for this episode? Is the FBI going to pay me a visit because I can't call up fascism when I see it because I'm worried that fascism is destroying our nation? But fascism says that calling out fascism is terrorism? Do you see how none of this makes sense, but Newspeak doesn't give us the opportunity to think critically about this situation? Hard stop. So that's fascism. And lowercase a, anti-fascism, is wholesome. Anti-fascism was the unifying cause of the Allied forces in World War II, and anti-fascist forces utilized the same infrastructure, technology, industry, transportation, mass communication to mobilize against fascism. They used that same infrastructure against it. That's historical anti-fascism. So where did capital A Antifa come from? Surprise, it's Newspeak. In the next episode, we'll learn how anti-fascism rises spontaneously and organically in opposition to groups and movements that would subjugate, isolate, and brutalize whole classes of people. That is, if I haven't been visited by Kash Patel. Also, I bet you didn't know, but I had a co-host this whole time. What a stinker.